All Hit Radio.
Welcome to the X Zone, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. Now, here's your host, Rob McConnell.
Woke up this morning with light in my eyes, and then realized it was still dark outside. It was a light coming down from the sky. I don't know who or why. Must be those strangers that come every night. Those saucer-shaped lights put people uptight. Leave blue-green footprints that glow in the dark. I hope they get home all right. Hey, Mr. Spaceman, won't you please take me along? I won't do anything wrong. Hey, Mr. Spaceman, won't you please take me along for a ride?
And welcome back to the X Zone, hour 2 of tonight's show, and the topic is still UFOs. Our guest this hour is retired Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Randle, who is a well-known researcher within the UFO community. He's a very well-known published author, and he's also a good friend of mine. He also has his own radio show called A Different Perspective on the X Zone Broadcast Network. And if you go to www.xzbn.net, just scroll down the page, you'll see Kevin's information. Click on that, and all his shows are there for you to listen to. So joining me now from parts unknown in the great United States of America, probably somewhere in Iowa, is Kevin Randle. Kevin, welcome back, buddy.
So you nailed it down to Iowa, did you?
Well, I forgot it was Idaho.
Or Ohio.
How are you, Kevin?
I'm doing well, and you?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Thanks for joining us tonight. It's always a great pleasure talking to you. And tonight's subject here on the X Zone, Kevin, is a subject that you're very well acquainted with, and I'm talking about UFOs. And I think that I'd like to let our listeners know a little bit about you and how you got into the field of ufology.
I always blame my mother for this.
I blame my mother for a lot, too. Go on.
She was a fan of science fiction, and science fiction deals with alien creatures and space travel and invasion and all that sort of thing. And it's not a large step from science fiction into some of the UFO literature that's going on out there that deals with the same sorts of things. Not quite as active, but certainly the same sort of thing. She took me to the movie Earth versus the Flying Saucers when I was a little kid. And that sort of got me started on the whole thing.
Now, one of the major topics that I know that you are very well acquainted with and have done a lot of researches with other eminent UFO researchers is the Roswell case of 1947. What is your take on that case now, after all the years that you've been investigating it?
Well, after Don and I had been in Roswell 5 or 6 times talking to witnesses, it seemed to be a very robust case, and we had a number of witnesses talking about having seen the alien bodies themselves and how the material was moved out of Roswell into other locations, specifically Wright Patterson Air Force Base. In today's environment, a lot of those witnesses turned out to be less than candid.
Really?
I'm thinking, like Frank Joyce told us a marvelous story being directly involved in this. He clearly was in Roswell in 1947. Walter Hott, who was the public relations officer at Roswell, had created a yearbook during the summer of 1947. So we had a listing of 1,500 people who were there at the time. And there's a picture of Kaufman in the yearbook. So we're thinking, okay, this is a good guy. Subsequent research, and majority of it done by Mark Rodiker, who is the scientific director from the Center for UFO Studies, Don Schmitt as well, and Mark Chesney were asked by Juanita Kaufman, after Frank had passed away, to go through some of his papers to make sure he had fulfilled all his contractual obligations, or there was nothing outstanding that she needed to do. And as they were going through their papers, that information discovered the documents that Kaufman had created that just simply were not true, to put him in the middle of the Roswell case. And so, here's a witness that we had thought was credible. Turned out he wasn't. Glenn Dennis was the same way, the Roswell mortician. Told a story about the nurse that he had some kind of romantic interest in. He was married at the time, and right after this event in July of 1947, she was transferred off the base, and she'd sent him a letter and saying she was going to England, and he wrote her a letter, and it came back marked deceased, and he claimed that 5 Army nurses had been killed in an aircraft accident. And we checked that. I went through the New York Times index, which was a paper thing you had to go through, but it had aircraft accidents. And I went from 1947 to 1952, could find no aircraft accident killed 5 Army nurses. Don Berliner went through the Stars and Stripes, which is a newspaper published overseas for the military. And there was no mention of that thing. So that was one key that Glenn Dennis wasn't telling the truth. So we kind of had to eliminate his tale from the case. But there's still a core of very credible people who have little bits and pieces of the story. So I lean toward the extraterrestrial explanation because I know of no mundane terrestrial explanation that explains all the evidence. But is that enough to accept it as an alien case? I would like something more. I'd basically like the smoking gun.
There are those people who claim to be researchers, and I'm not going to mention Cal's name, who tend to point to Project Mogul as the explanation of the incident. And what do you think about that, Project Mogul?
I thought there was a more of the question.
Well, there was going to be, but I decided to be nice.
Well, you don't have to be, because Project Mogul doesn't work. The culprit that they point to, flight number 4, which was flown on July 4th, 1947, well, it didn't fly. It was canceled. We have the documentation proving it. It says in the notes, it was the project was run by the New York University, and they were trying to create a constant level balloon. And the idea was to put a microphone up in this acoustical level in the atmosphere that they thought that sound would travel a long ways. Like there's an acoustical level in the ocean that does that, and they thought there would be one in the atmosphere. And if they could put a balloon up there with a microphone, they might be able to detect atomic detonations in the Soviet Union. It was never deployed, but in June of 1947, they had moved to New Mexico to launch these long trains, arrays of balloons and ray wind targets and all of this. And what we found out was, according to the notes kept by the leader of the project, Dr. Albert Crary, flight number 4, which is the culprit they point to, he says the flight was canceled. Well, if the flight was canceled, how could it have dropped debris on the Brazel Ranch for him to find? And the other problem is, it was weather balloons and ray wind targets, common meteorological equipment, nothing extraordinary about it, nothing to fool anybody. So it simply doesn't work. So we eliminate Project Mogul. There's nothing else that we have come across. We looked at the records from White Sands Missile Range to see if they had dropped a missile in the area. There was, I think, a test in July of 1947. I think it was July 16th, of a missile that went array from White Sands and crashed it near Juarez, Mexico, for example. So but we have all those missile tests, rocket tests, accounted for in the record. There was no extraordinary aircraft accident. Colonel Richard Weaver, who conducted the Air Force investigation in the mid-1990s, confirmed all of this for us, that there was nothing there other than Project Mogul, and we can eliminate Mogul based on the documentation. So we're left with no current terrestrial explanation for what fell at Roswell. Everybody agrees something fell. It's just whether it was terrestrial, was it extraterrestrial? As I said, I lean toward the extraterrestrial now because I know of no terrestrial explanation. And Don Schmitt and Tom Carey and I and others have looked for those explanations. And that was, we spent time at White Sands. We spent time in various libraries. Tom did archaeological research to see if there was something there that might have accounted for that in the anthropological records, for example. We just got nowhere with that. And I thought if there was some kind of postulate some kind of an atomic accident. The 509th Bomb Group in Roswell in 1947 was the only atomic strike force in the world at the time. They had aircraft that could be fitted with the atomic bombs. The bombs weren't stored in Roswell. The bombs were stored elsewhere, but they had that capability. So I thought maybe there was something related to that. One of the witnesses that Tom and Don interviewed talked about seeing in the bomb bay of a B-29 this object that he described to him. He saw it in like late 1947, and when I read the description, it sounded like the mock-up of an atomic bomb. It's the MK3 atomic bomb. It had a big fat nose, and then it tapered back to a tail section, and that's basically what he described it. And the key was, he said it was in a silver plate B-29. Well, they had been modified to carry the atomic bomb, so the silver plate B-29s were sort of a classified thing as well. So I thought maybe they would have been practicing with one of these atomic bombs and accidentally dropped it near the Brazel Ranch. It was, it was a nerd. It wasn't a bomb that would explode.
Right.
But in 1947, the size and shape of the bomb was classified information, so that would suggest a recovery operation that would have been carried out in somewhat secrecy with tarp-covered flatbeds and all of that sort of thing. And had that been the explanation, I'm sure that Colonel Weaver and his investigation would have uncovered it. And they said, well, here's what it was, and we're all done. But they didn't come up with anything other than Project Mogul. And that was given to them by, I think, a guy named Robert Todd, and Carl Flock also was talking about it. I had seen that explanation earlier and didn't buy it. The one thing Weaver did that was good for us is he was the one that recovered Crary's field notes and diary, so that we could say, well, it says it didn't fly. And if you go to the big Air Force report that they published, you can find all that information in there. The other thing they said, which was interesting, was that Mogul was highly classified. Well, what they were doing in New Mexico wasn't classified at all. It was the purpose of it. And Charles Moore, who worked on the New York University Balloon Project, which is the Project Mogul, said we didn't even know the name in 1947, but if you go through Crary's field notes, he mentions Mogul 3 or 4 times. So the whole Mogul explanation is just, it simply doesn't work. And I don't understand why the skeptical community clings to that explanation with the documentation refuting it.
How long have you been doing research into the Roswell project, Kevin?
Don and I started, the first trip to Roswell was in February of 1989.
Wow.
I had met Don at a science fiction convention in Milwaukee, and it was going to be 3 science fiction writers against the 2 guys coming up from the Center for UFO Studies. I was one of the science fiction writers. And when Don showed up, the other guy couldn't make it, and I didn't think it was fair 3 to 1, so I switched sides because it was a debate. So that's what you do in a debate. You're supposed to be able to argue either side. And so I switched sides. And after that, talking to Don, and he learned about my military background, and they were going to investigate the Roswell case. They were going to reopen the investigation because it kind of died out. And what intrigued them about me was my military background. And a lot of the witnesses would be former military, I was going to say officers, but both military officers enlisted. And they thought I would be able to relate to them better and understand the terminology and the jargon better than a civilian coming into it. So Don had called me and asked me if I wanted to go to Roswell to look into this, and I said, sure. Our attitude when we went down there in February of 1989 was we're going to find an explanation.
All right, Kevin, we're going to have a bit of a cliffhanger. I've got to take my break here. Exonation, Kevin Randle's my very special guest. He is a retired lieutenant colonel from the U.S. military. Very credible guy, a great author. And we'll be back on the other side of this break discussing more of the UFO phenomenon with a military expert, Kevin Randle, on the other side of this break. My name's Rob McConnell. This is the X Zone. You're listening to us on your hometown radio, Classic 1220, classic1220.ca.
Mr. Spaceman, won't you please take me along for a ride? Woke up this morning, I was feeling
I was waiting for so long for a miracle to come. Everyone told me to be strong. humanity. Through the darkness.
Welcome back, everyone. Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Randle, doctor. On top of that, Kevin has a PhD, is our special guest tonight. His website is kevinrandle.blogspot.com. And as always, Kevin, thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for your service over the years when you were with the military.
Well, thank you, Rob. I appreciate that.
Okay, so Kevin, when it comes to the Roswell case, what significance did Stanton Friedman have to do with it? Because whenever you talk about Roswell, everybody says, oh, the Stanton Friedman case.
Well, Stan was in New Orleans in 77 or 78. And he was at the TV station talking to the station manager, and the station manager says, well, the guy you need to talk to is Jesse Marcel. Marcel, turns out he was the air intelligence officer of the Roswell base in 1947. So Friedman called Marcel and got the story of the crashed UFO and really didn't care. Because Marcel didn't have a good fix on the date, and just said it was when he was stationed in Roswell in 1947. Eventually, he met with a guy named Vern Maltese after one of his lectures, and they talked about a friend of theirs named Barney Barnett, who'd seen a crashed UFO in 1947. Bill Moore was then doing research into something dealing with UFOs, and was looking at newspapers from the very beginning of the modern, what they classify as the modern era, June and July of 1947, and came across a picture of Marcel in the newspaper with the Raywin target, the balloon debris that was taken into General Ramey's office for photographic purposes. And so they got involved with the investigation. Bill Moore and Charles Berlitz wrote a book about called the Roswell Incident that Bill Moore himself described as a disgraceful hodgepodge of fact and fiction. And the story really didn't go anywhere. And then Friedman got off on the MJ-12 track, and the whole thing kind of died. Mark Rodiker at the Center for UFO Studies had asked Friedman at one point, is there still work to be done on the Roswell case? And Friedman said yes. So that was how the center got involved, and through the center, that was how I got involved. But Friedman talked to Jesse Marcel, didn't think much of it. It was really Len Stringfield in 1978 who was collecting stories of crash retrievals, as he called them, that talked to Marcel as well. And at the MUFON Symposium in the summer of 1978, mentioned the Marcel case. The story came out in I think it was the National Enquirer, about the UFO crash and that sort of thing. So, to be fair, Friedman kind of stumbled across the case. I'm not sure what would have happened. There was a woman named Linda Corley who interviewed Marcel. They both lived in Houma, Louisiana, and she was going to college and had to do some kind of research paper. So she sat down and spent 4 hours with Marcel and got the story from him as well. So I think the story would have gotten out, but to be fair, Stan Friedman kind of bird dogged the thing, gave up on it. Bill Moore got the book published, and everything went into a suspended animation at that time until Don and I started poking around.
What about the MJ-12 papers? You mentioned them briefly.
Complete and total hoax. These were documents that were sent on 35 millimeter film to Bill Moore, anonymously, I might add. And it's allegedly a briefing to President-elect Eisenhower in November of 1952, about the UFO situation, and details the Roswell case. I think there's eight or 9 pages of it. Gives a list of the members of the MJ-12 committee, talks a little bit about the crash retrieval. There's an index that lists, or a table of contents that lists all kinds of other papers and documents, but we don't have those because they would be very hard to fake. It turns out we don't have the original documents. We have photographs of them, and I think anybody who has studied questioned documents will tell you if you don't have the original documents, you have nothing. And that was what tripped up, by the way, Dan Rather and CBS News with the great story about the President Bush's National Guard service. They had some documents that suggested his service was less than credible, and they didn't have the original documents either. They had copies of the documents, and so they got hammered on that. And the same thing should be with MJ-12. We don't have the original documents, and some of the information in the documents does not pan out. They talk about another crash in what the El Guerrero Indio area, El Indio and Guerrero area of Mexico, which is near Del Rio, which was a crash allegedly from 1948, and then it was 1950, and then it was later. Single witness is Robert Willingham, but the case is a hoax. There's no question about it being a hoax. I investigated that in depth and actually exposed Willingham as a liar, talking about his military experience, and as you said, the stolen valor type thing. He had claimed to be a retired Air Force colonel, and it turned out when I got his military records, he had served 13 months in the military at the end of World War II, from December of 1945 to January of 1947. So he was in the service. So he could claim to be a veteran of World War II, but he joined the service after all the shooting had stopped. But that was the only military service he had. He rose to the rank of E4, a low-ranking enlisted grade, and other things just didn't check out. But the point simply here is that story that he was telling about the crash, and I think in the MJ-12 papers it says it was December 6, 1950, turns out to be a hoax. Well, my question is, how could a paper created for the president about UFO crashes contain this hoax material? They would have known it was a hoax. They would have known what was recovered. They would have known all of that stuff. So if they're preparing a paper for the president to brief him on UFOs, they would have known that story was a hoax, and it wouldn't appear in the MJ-12 documents. And I look at it as the poison pill, the thing that just sabotages the whole thing. And there's other problems with the MJ-12 paper. And I think majority of the people in the UFO community now realize that MJ-12 is a hoax.
In your opinion, Kevin, why hasn't there been full disclosure on the UFO situation by the government?
That was a question that people would ask me frequently. I didn't have a good answer. And I was doing a book called UFOs in the Deep State. And I was curious about it because I was always said, if I was the president, I could get the information. And yet you have presidents all up and down the line that say, no, I knew nothing about this. And how do you keep a secret like that from the president? I discovered the ways it's done. You have the bureaucrats at the upper levels working under the appointees, the presidential appointees in the various cabinet departments. But these guys, shouldn't say these guys and gals go on for administration to administration, and they know where literally all the bodies are buried. And it's all about power, and it's all about money. And they're maintaining their power, and they're maintaining the money. If a president asks them for information about UFO specific information, and I'm the president, I say to the CIA director, I want all your information on UFOs. My answer is the CIA director's answer would be, well, Mr. President, that's various agencies are involved. I'll gather all the material, and we'll create a comprehensive report for you, and somehow it never gets done. And other things come up, and the president's attention is diverted, and he forgets about it, or he doesn't do it. And there's an example of this. There was what was called Operation Solo. It has nothing to do with UFOs. It had to do with spying. There was a guy named Morris Childs, and in the 1930s, he was a rabid communist. He was the leader of the American Communist Party. He was right at the top. And he eventually changed his mind, but he was a pal of the Soviets. They would invite him to Moscow all the time. The FBI flipped him. And so he was then spying on the FBI. And this operation was run out of the New York office because they didn't want to do it in Washington, D.C., where everything's leaked out. And they didn't tell the president about it. The only time they conferred with the president about Morris Childs and what he was talking about was when Gerald Ford had become president after Nixon resigned, had a comprehensive meeting coming up with the Soviets, and he was worried about it, and they briefed him on this mission. The book's called Operation Solo. It's by a guy named John Barrett, and if you want to understand how you can keep secrets like this, that's the book to look at, because it doesn't matter anymore because the Soviet Union is gone and Morris Childs died. He got one of the highest awards that the CIA can give because he was such an asset to them all during the Cold War. So that's the way you keep the secret. You keep it away from the people. You worry about your power and your money, and it always comes back to that. And I outlined all this and some of the other activities like that in UFOs in the Deep State.
There seems to be dissension within the UFO community these days. Have you seen that as far as your contacts and what you've been able to see within the UFO community?
Well, the problem I have with what's going on today is we've got the so-called whistleblowers who don't offer any way of any information that we can corroborate.
Mm-hmm.
They talk a good game, but they don't provide names or dates or locations or anything that we can check out. The only exception to that was David Grush, who was interviewed on, I think, what is it, News Nation?
Yes.
One of the new news cable shows, and he talked about two crashes, one in Italy in 1933 that Mussolini and the fascists there had secured, and somehow the information leaked to the Pope and it got to the United States. So when the war ended, we ended up with the UFO from that, and the Roswell case. Well, we know that the 1933 crash in Italy didn't happen. It's a hoax. And some of my colleagues in Italy had done research into this 20 years ago and proved it to be a hoax. And I listed a lot. I think I've got the documents or links to the documents up on my blog from last July or something like that about how this whole thing came apart. So I'm wondering, if David Grush didn't know that the Italian crash was a hoax, how valuable is his other information? We don't know what it is. And that's the problem. They keep talking about we're having these in-camera sessions, these classified sessions, and giving us the information, but we on the outside never get information, and it's quite worrisome.
Yeah, it was kind of a wash as far as I'm concerned, watching the congressional hearings, because nothing was brought to the public. And my understanding was that this was to give information to the public in front of Congress, and that didn't happen.
They kept dodging a question. I watched it as well as you did, and he kept dodging the question. If they asked for specifics, he said, "Well, that's classified. I can't talk about it. We'll do it in a SCIF meeting, which is a classified briefing for the Congress." But as far as I know, those briefings haven't taken place. The information hasn't been passed on, and I'm thinking that if is it Tim Burchett, the Tennessee representative, who's really hot on this?
Yep. I'm
thinking if I'm him, I'd want to talk to people like me. Yeah. Because I investigated these UFO crashes for 25 years. I know where the hoaxes are. I know what the good things are. I know what the good information is. And we can't get even the information that's out in the public arena out of that, other than the couple of things that have been said.
Kevin, stand by, my friend. We've got to take our break. When we come back, we'll continue this conversation. Exonation, my guest is retired Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Randle, PhD, I might add. His website is kevinrandle.blogspot.com, and Kevin and I will return on the other side of this break as we continue here in the X Zone on your hometown radio, Classic 1220, classic1220.ca.
Oh, it's almost blinding me. Every once in a while, I'd see her smile. She turned my day around. A girl with those eyes.
And welcome back. This is the X Zone. I'm Rob McConnell, and we're coming to you from our broadcast center and studios in St. Catharines, Ontario, on your hometown radio, Classic 1220, and around the world on classic1220.ca. Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Randle, retired, is my special guest. He is also a doctor. He has a PhD. And we're talking about UFOs. And before we went to the break, Kevin, we were talking about the congressional hearings. I found them a waste of time.
Yeah, we learned nothing. And there were a number of other hearings as well. And one of them, they had two representatives from the Department of the Navy. And it was clear that they really didn't know much about the UFOs. And I thought one of the congressmen who was quizzing them actually knew more than they did. And he asked about the incident in Minot, North Dakota in 1967. Belt, Montana, where a flight of Minuteman missiles was shut down by an outside force, which supposedly couldn't happen.
Was that Maelstrom Air Force Base?
Yes.
The report was out, or the story was leaked out by Captain Robert Salas.
Well, the story had been actually out prior to that.
Oh, it had been.
They shut down, and there was a whole bunch of UFO sightings in the Project Blue Book files from Belt, Montana. They didn't mention the shutdown of the missiles, but did mention the UFO sightings that were going on at that time. So it's kind of interesting that way, because if an outside force could shut down the missiles, this was a matter of national security.
Big time.
It doesn't matter whether it was UFOs or whatever it is. We didn't want our competitors in the world to know that the missile flights could be shut down by an outside force. So that made sense to me. But when we were looking at all of that sort of thing, the one of the congressmen in the session mentioned those sightings, and the two representatives said, well, we don't know anything about that. And I'd written about it in books and everything prior to that. And as you said, Salas had been on the lecture circuit talking about it. And these guys who supposedly were the inside sources, the inside knowledge, knew nothing about it. Then later on in the discussion, one of them said, well, I've heard something about that. So that just gives you the idea of the value of these meetings. I watched the NASA briefing too that they did, and it was just the same stuff. Well, we're going to be doing this, we're going to be doing that, we're going to investigate this way, but nothing of substance comes out about what they're investigating, what they found, and what the results are. There's no transparency, and that was supposedly the big thing. We're going to have all this transparency.
Maybe there's nothing to be transparent about.
But if you look at the Project Blue Book files, if you look at the history of the way they've manipulated the information from the very beginning, in 1948, Project Sign, which was a forerunner to Project Blue Book, the officers and the scientists working on Project Sign created what they called an estimate of the situation about UFOs. And their conclusion was that it was interplanetary as opposed to interstellar, but interplanetary. And this went up to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Vandenberg, and he looked at it and says, you didn't prove it, and rejected the report and ordered it destroyed. And the whole attitude of the investigation changed. Then we have the summer of 1952, where we had all the UFO sightings over North America. And my favorite headline in the world was in the Cedar Rapids Gazette. And the banner headline on the front page, saucers swarm over Capitol. I'm thinking, this is a headline out of a science fiction movie if I've ever seen one. But the upshot of that was the CIA sponsored an investigation in January of 1953, 6 months after that, to get down to the bottom of the UFO situation. And their conclusion was there was nothing to that, and we should change our messaging, show people sightings that look mysterious, that have been solved by mundane explanations, don't allow teachers to accept book reports or projects dealing with UFOs, just shut the whole thing down. But the key was the report was written before the panel met. So they were shutting it down. We get to the Condon Committee, the University of Colorado study in 1969, supposedly going to look at this thing in a scientific arena. We know that the conclusions were written before they investigated anything. We've got the letter from Robert Hippler, who was a scientific advisor in the Air Force. he wrote to Robert Lowe, who was at the University of Colorado, and says, here's what we'd like you to find. The Air Force did a good job of the investigation. There's nothing of scientific value for us to continue the investigation, and the Air Force should end Project Blue Book. And lo and behold, 18 months later, that's exactly what they said. Condon, who was Edward Condon, who was the leader of the Condon Committee, the investigation at the university, was in Corning, New York, and he told the engineers there that he thought that there was really nothing to this UFO thing, but he wasn't supposed to come to that conclusion for another 18 months. So when you look at the history of this, we can see how that information is manipulated. If you go back to the Project Blue Book files, they say, well, 701 cases were unsolved, and there's always going to be a residue because you don't have enough data to solve them. But there are like 4,000 or 5,000 cases that are insufficient insufficient data for a scientific analysis, which means they have no solution. And we can look at cases where the solution simply doesn't fit. And I think of Levelland. These were the sightings in November of 1957 where the craft was close to the ground, stalled car engines. There were literally dozens of witnesses. The sheriff was involved. Air Force officers were involved. I laid all that out in a book cleverly called Levelland. I found that Air Force officers were with the sheriff. The sheriff got close enough for his car to be stalled, and if his car was stalled, so was theirs. But we can't find those Air Force officers. The point simply is the Air Force wrote it off as ball lightning. Ball lightning, if it even exists, is a very short-lived phenomena, never much bigger than 2 feet in diameter. We've got dozens of witnesses over a 2.5, 3 hour area talking about the craft coming down, stalling their car engines. When they leave, they can start their cars. There's reports of burned areas where the craft landed. I mean, if you'd done a proper investigation in 1957, we might be having a different discussion. The point simply is there's a lot of good, credible evidence used following multiple chains of evidence that has been suppressed, ignored, argued about. Don Kehoe, who was the leader of NICAP in 1957, got into an argument with the Air Force over the number of witnesses. I mean, how does that advance our study? What you need to argue about is what is the evidence? What are the witnesses saying? We know the sheriff was coerced into changing his story because I've got reports that were written prior to the Air Force investigation where he's talking about seeing I think he's called it a football-shaped object. And like I said, his car was stalled. And when he's talking to the Air Force investigator, the Air Force official report says the sheriff saw a streak of red light for 2 seconds in the distance, 1,000 feet away or something like that. That's not what he said. Later on, Don Berliner interviewed him, the sheriff, and I hate his name. It's Ware Clem. I mean, talk about nonsensical name, but talked to him in 1975, I think it was, and the sheriff told him the same story and mentioned he said there were hundreds of people who had called the sheriff's office to report this strange light over a period of 2.5 hours. So when you look at that, the totality of that kind of thing, you can see that where we are today is where we were 25 years ago. Investigations are going on, we get no information, and the information we get is probably bogus.
But with all the different organizations out there, non-governmental, I mean private, like MUFON, and there's other UFO organizations that are run by the public, they claim to be investigators. And when you look at what their credentials are, they're just hobbyists who have an interest in UFOs. They don't know how to collect evidence. They don't know how to conduct a proper investigation. They certainly don't know how to take proper photography. They don't know how to do anything that a seasoned investigator and professional like yourself would be able to do. And I'm just wondering how these organizations and the amount of information they put on the internet, how it's tainting the actual validity of UFO investigations.
Well, I'm not going to argue the point. In defense of MUFON, I will say at least they attempt to train their the field investigators as opposed to the regular members. I do have a copy of the manuals so I can see what they've done. APRO had field investigators, NICAP had field investigators, but as you say, an awful lot of it was basically hobbyists.
Well, I'm not saying basically back then. I should have prefaced by before the advent of the internet.
Well, yeah, and the point is valid. And the other problem you run into is their bias. The members of the UFO organizations have a bias to finding unidentified cases.
Right.
On the flip side of that, the skeptical community has a bias to explain everything, regardless of what the evidence is. The skeptics cannot say, this one is a puzzler. I just don't know how to explain it. Does it mean it's extraterrestrial? Not necessarily, but I don't know what the solution is. We don't have a good solution. Kind of like the Roswell case. We've done the investigations. We don't have a solution, but then again, we don't have the evidence that propels us to the extraterrestrial situation. And there's an awful lot of bogus information on the internet as well, and about everything. There was a wonderful commercial where this girl was meeting her French boyfriend, and it turns out to be some fat slob from New York, and it says, well, you can't put anything on the internet, it's not true. Well, yeah, you can. Yeah. And we've seen now how the internet's been manipulated by the governments. So you've got to take a look at all of that. You've got to get to the original sources. And I think that's the key. We often don't get to the original sources of the information. It's somebody reported this. Well, did you talk to the regular person? No, I talked to his friend who told me this type of thing. Friend of a friend type thing.
And even then, Kevin, when you're talking to authors who write books about UFOs and they say, well, yes, I actually talked to this person and this is what he said, we don't know whether or not that author is telling us the truth or if it's just a ploy to sell a book.
Well, now you've treaded on a point that's really kind of a sore point with me.
Now, I wasn't referring to you by any stretch of the imagination.
Now listen. I interviewed a guy named J. Bond Johnson, who was the photographer of the material in General Ramey's office in 1947. I got the story from Johnson. He told me what was going on. And lo and behold, several months later, a new story arrives. Johnson has changed his tune, and he's talking about how I misquoted him.
Whoa.
And he didn't know what was in the Ramey's office when he photographed it. He thinks the real stuff was mixed in with this balloon debris. And I said, that's not what you told me. You told me at least 7 times in the interview that General Ramey told you the minute you got there that it was a weather balloon and it was no big deal. He says, well, I never said that. And I thought, would you like to hear the tapes?
Ah.
And I sent him a tape, and I edited the tape so he could hear himself say the points he claimed he never said. And the story then became, well, Randle sent me the tapes, but he edited them. So it wasn't what I said. So I sent him the raw tapes.
All right, hold on, Kevin. We'll be back on the other side of this final break. And Exonation, if you'd like to find out more about Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Randle, the books he has, the books he's written, it's all on his great website, kevinrandle.blogspot.com. And Kevin and I return as we wrap up tonight's show here in the X Zone from our beautiful studios in St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada on Classic 1220 and classic1220.ca.
You'll never do, but I wish someone had to talk to me like I want to talk to you. Ooh, I've been to Georgia and California and anywhere I could run. Took the hand of a preacher man and we made love in the sun, but I ran out of place.
And welcome back, everyone. Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Randle, retired, PhD, is my special guest tonight. And if you'd like to find out more about Kevin, the great books he's written, just go to his blogspot, kevinrandle.blogspot.com. And to listen to past editions of Kevin's show, A Different Perspective, on the X Zone Broadcast Network, go to www.xzbn.net. Kevin, let's finish off the topic that we were talking about before we went to this break.
Well, you had asked, how do we know that the authors of the books are telling the truth of the interviews? And my long form answer was basically, if you ask me that question, I have the interviews on tape and you can listen to the people themselves. I also do something on my blog, which I call chasing footnotes. So if a writer's put footnotes in the book, I look at the footnote and then I try to go to the source that's been cited there. And if it's another source, I go to that one until I get to the original source. And then I can find out if the person has quoted the original source properly. So there are ways to verify the information that the authors are putting out there, but you have to do a little bit of work to get to that point. And like I said, I've got lots of notes and tapes and interviews like that, so that you can see that I haven't misquoted people. And that was the whole point of the J. Bond Johnson story, because they'd been telling everybody I'd misquoted him, and I said, would you like to hear the quotes? In fact, Stan Friedman had claimed I misquoted General Exxon, and I sent Exxon the tapes of the interview, and I said, and a copy of the book where he's quoted, and I said, where are the quotes wrong? And he said, well, you quoted me accurately. So, I mean, there's the end of that discussion.
There seems to be at times a rivalry between UFO investigators and researchers. Why don't you guys? Well, not you, because I know you do work with everybody. But why is there so much so many people not sharing information? Like, you were in military intelligence, I was in the police force. We shared information within, and this is how we got our work done. This is how in police work crimes are solved, by sharing information with other departments, other investigators. And yet, within the UFO community, it's the same as within the paranormal community. Everybody holds the information they have close to their chest because they're all waiting for the big break, that 15 minutes of fame. Wouldn't they get more accomplished by working together instead of apart?
I think you've kind of put your finger on it. It's the 15th minute of fame. Now, I've attended science fiction conventions, and I've written science fiction books. Yes, I write science fiction, and they've been published. But what I noticed is, if you showed up at a convention with a copy of your latest novel, there would be other writers there that were mad because they felt you were taking money out of their pocket. They couldn't possibly write all the books, but they always felt if you sold a book, that was somehow inhibiting their ability to earn money there. Stan Friedman had the same attitude, that if you were doing a lecture, somehow you've taken that lecture away from me. I did a lecture in Cincinnati, Ohio, and while I was there, the host told me that Stan had called them and said, why did you have Kevin Randle come in? Why didn't you call me? Didn't you want a scientist? And I said, well, you should have said to him, yeah, we did. Do you know one? But the point is, and I can document that. He did the same thing to Jim Moseley. He did the same thing to Robert Hastings. And I have the information from both those guys, from their correspondence with them, explaining the whole situation. So I think that's part of it. It's, well, you're taking money away from me if I let you have the information, and you're somehow not helping me. I try to share everything I have. I know there were cases, as I was preparing a book and I had some inside information on something, I would hold that close to the vest until the book was published. But again, the other side of the coin, I don't mean to keep picking on Stan Friedman, but if you go to Crash and Corona, you'll find a bunch of interviews in his book that were conducted by Don Schmitt and me without credit or attribution, and yet he had written to our publisher before our book was published, accusing us of doing that very thing. And again, I have the documentation to prove it. So there's a lot of that pettiness. There's a lot of that, I got to be the number one guy, and if I hold my information, then you've got to come to me to get it type thing. And I'm thinking, no, I just sent a bunch of information to a guy that dealt with a 1933 UFO crash in Italy. He asked me, do you have any information on that? I sent him everything I had, just emailed it to him. So I try to share the information. There's really nothing I have that I consider proprietary at the moment.
Prior to this segment, we were talking about the congressional hearings. And why weren't investigators like yourself and Don Schmitt and other investigators who've actually done the investigation into many UFO cases brought on the committee to respond to questions from Congress instead of people who really had no idea what the hell they were talking about.
I think it has to do with whose name pops up on the internet. This last year for me has not been one where I've been able to do a lot of things that I wanted to do for personal reasons.
Right.
But I know Don has been in contact with Tim Burchett, and they keep talking about how they're going to bring us forward to talk about this thing. I may be the leading authority on UFO crashes, civilian leading authority on UFO crashes, because I've done 2 books about it. And the vast majority of this stuff is bogus. And I think that's part of the problem. I'm not one of the guys, if you tell me about a UFO crash and I find out it's bogus, I'm going to say that. I'm not going to embrace everything you say as the truth without researching it. So when they talk about some of these things, I know they're bogus, and I think that might inhibit part of it. And then the other point is I don't have an agent, a publicist.
Right.
Who, and some of the people whose names keep popping up, they have publicists, and yet I still get phone calls. I've been called 3 times to do Ancient Aliens, and my circumstances has not allowed me to do that show, and I'm not sure that I'd really want to do it. But there's been times like that. I was called to do a show that was going to film in Roswell in July, and I said, I can't go, I can't do that. And I said, talk to Don, talk to Tom, and they talked to Don, and they were going to come to the house to interview me, but my circumstance changed, and I was able to go to Roswell. But I mean, I think that's part of it, and there is people who manage to capture the news media for a moment. They become the darlings of the UFO field, and we've seen a number of that from the To the Stars Academy, for example. They're going to solve the UFO problem.
Whatever happened with them? You don't hear about them anymore.
They changed their mission statement, and so they were going more toward the entertainment side of it as opposed to the investigation. So it's just whose name pops up. I know in some cases I trend very high, and other times you have to search for days to find my name. So.
You know what I think your problem is, Kevin? And take this from a friend. You're too honest. And you can't be bought.
I said to my wife a number of times, I know how to become the #1 UFO guy, and that's just to embrace everything.
Yeah.
But I just can't do that. If I've got a solution, I have to tell you what it is. And if you don't like, Jerry Clark and I have argued about the Charles Whitted UFO sighting from 1948, the cigar-shaped craft passed their airliner with the windows glowing on it. I am absolutely convinced it was a bolide now, based on what we've seen from other sightings where we know what the explanation was. And Jerry is convinced they saw a cigar-shaped UFO. We talk about that. Jerry and I talk about that periodically, and it's just one of those things where we agree to disagree. But I think that's one of the problems is if you solve cases that may be the darlings of some of the other aspects of the UFO community, they're not really happy with you, and you don't get the invites. I did a MUFON conference 20 years ago, or not quite 20 years ago, where we were talking, well, more than 20 years ago now that I think about it. I did a presentation on alien abduction and the connection to pop culture. And everybody who came up to lecture after, I got the #1 spot, I was the lead-off lecturer, and everybody practically that came up after me had to explain why I was wrong.
Oh my gosh.
But I think that if you look at the abduction phenomena today, you'll find out that what I was saying was true for an awful lot of the abduction cases. There are trustful explanations.
What did you say? What were the explanations? We've got about 3 minutes, Kev.
Well, one of the things I said that some of it is drawn from the pop culture, and I pointed out there was a program in the Twilight Zone called Hocus Pocus and Frisbee, where it is basically the alien abduction scenario, and the aliens look like what Barney Hill was describing in that abduction. I don't think Barney Hill consciously made up the story. I think the hypnotic regressions and everything kind of contributed to the creation of the story. But part of that was the hypnotic regressions done by people who are not classically trained, professionally trained, draw out of their experiencers, the abductees, what they want to hear. And if there's information that suggests there may be a mundane explanation, they ignore that information. I did a case in Utah that I thought was a good abduction case, and it was the first time it was reported that the aliens had come into the house. I mean, I published it in a magazine, and you go back and you look, nobody was talking about that prior to that publication. I am now convinced that was an episode of sleep paralysis, because I understand what sleep paralysis is now, and we didn't really study it at the time. So I think some of the abduction phenomena, for example, was sleep paralysis. And I mentioned these sorts of things, and they were saying, well, why this case couldn't be sleep paralysis? Well, no, there's another explanation. Maybe it's the hypnotist that was the problem. So you got to look at that. Bud Hopkins challenged us once to say, show me on my interviews where I've conducted leading questions. I've used leading questions of the witness, and I said, challenge accepted. I put something up on my blog with a long story about, here's what he said. Look at the questions. Look how he led the witness. And when we were in Utah, the lady that had the aliens in the house, it was James Harder who was doing it. And afterwards, I realized how he had led the witness to where he wanted to go. So it's that kind of thing. And,
Sure.
I wanted to get that out there so we could eliminate those cases and study on the ones that may be good.
Just a quick note, I remember you did a show with Bud Hopkins' ex-wife. And,
yes.
And she basically said that he, was all hocus pocus with Bud.
Yeah, she was doing a documentary,
Yeah.
and I've talked to her a couple of times since then, and she hadn't got it completed. I haven't talked to her in a year, so I don't know what the status is, but that is also true, that she was there when she was filming the sessions and things like that, so she could see where things went wrong.
Kevin, the time has come when I must say so long to you, my good friend. I want to thank you so much for coming on the show, Kevin, and I wish you nothing but the very best for the year 2024, and please don't be a stranger.
Well, it can't be any worse than 2023.
Take care of yourself, my good friend, and thank you so much for sharing with us tonight.
Thank you, Rob.
Exonation, if you'd like to find out more about Kevin, if you'd like to buy his books, please visit his website, kevinrandle.blogspot.com. I'll be back tomorrow night at 10 o'clock as once again we'll start our investigation into the world of the paranormal and the science of parapsychology here in the X Zone with yours truly, Rob McConnell. And we're heard Monday through Friday right here from the studios of our great radio station that we're with now, Classic 1220, and on classic1220.ca. So until tomorrow night, my friends, always keep your eyes to the sky and your heart to the light. Good night, everyone.